Hello, everybody. Welcome to another reading of the history of economics, the past as the present. So, it's the second reading that we are having of this book by great John Kenneth Galbraith, and I've been joined in the panel by Sikshardhan Garu as Sikshardhan Garu. Welcome to the panel.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, everyone who is watching.
Yeah. So
Hello,
last
sir.
week
How are
was
you
it
doing,
the
sir?
intro chapter. Today we are going to
Yes.
chapter 2, which is called After Adam. Sir, please proceed, sir.
All right, sir. Yeah. So, fellows, we are going into the chapter number 2. It's titled After Adam. There can there can at any given time be an absence of answers to the questions suggested in the last chapter because economic thought has not developed to the requisite level of sophistication. Or there can be an absence of answers because the questions themselves have not yet arisen. With distinguished exceptions, more historians of economic thought have attributed the failure to provide answers to the first default. More is to be attributed to the second. In the time of the Greek city-states and the Athenian Empire, and later in the age of Rome, many, if not most, of the problems mentioned did not, in fact, exist. The basic industry of both Greece and Rome was agriculture. The producing unit was the household, the labor force was the slaves. The intellectual, political, cultural, and a substantial measure of the residential life centered on the cities, and it is of these Sparta, Corinth, Athens, and most notably Rome that the history is written. But the ancient cities, large or, as was the common case, very small, Rome and a few Italian cities excepted, were not economic centers as the term is now understood. There were markets and craftsmen, more of the latter slaves. There was, however, little industrial activity of a kind that would now be recognized as such. The use or consumption of goods, primitive shelter, elementary nutrients, perhaps some drink, some cloth, little else, was infinitesimal for all but a minute governing minority. For this minority, the greatest consumption was in services, again the slaves. Ancient Greece and Rome were not a far from controversial point. Consumer goods economies. It is somewhat unclear how the inhabitants of the Greek and Italian cities, including Rome, paid for the foodstuffs and wine they drew from the countryside. Most of the material goods were probably bought with the rents and other revenues or exactions that accrued to absentee landowners who lived in the cities and that were now recycled to pay for the product of the farms and vineyards. Perhaps also in some cases the city dwellers were simply paid in kind, or their revenue may have come in the form of taxes, which could be used in turn to pay for the produce. And the silver mines provided revenue to Athens as military tribute did to Rome. It is certain that grain and other products came in volume to the ports of the Piraeus and Ostia, but it has never been quite so clear what those ports sent out in return. Discussion of the economic questions of this era is principally to be found in the writings of Aristotle, and there is not a rich yield. No one can read his works without secretly suspecting a certain measure of eloquent incoherence or economics. Secretly, quote unquote, because the author being Aristotle, no one can wisely suggest such a thing. But more to the point, very few of the questions with which economics later became concerned applied to the society of which Aristotle spoke. Those problems with which he was occupied, to which indeed he was impelled, had a notably ethical intonation. In the words of Alexander Gray, a distinguished student of the history of economic ideas, quote unquote, economics was not merely the attendant of the handmaiden of ethics, as, per, as, as perhaps she should always be. She was crushed and blotted out by her more prosperous and pampered sister, and later excavators in search of the origins of economic theory can only dig out disconnected fragments and mangled remains. Unquote. The elementary character of economic life apart, the most important reason that ethical questions were addressed to the exclusion of economic ones in the ancient world was the existence of slavery. Quote, at all times and in all places, the Greek world relied on some form or forms of dependent labor to meet its needs, both public and private. By dependent labor, I mean work performed under compulsions other than those of kinship or communal obligations. Unquote. Since wages were not paid for labor, it followed in a reasonably evident way that there could be no view of how wages were determined. And as was true in Athens and in the Greek cities generally, because slaves did the work, labor had a derogatory aspect that helped to exclude it from scholarly consideration. The ethical justification of slavery and the terms of the treatment of the slaves became instead the interesting questions, as in this defense of the institution by Aristotle. Quote, the lower sort are by nature slaves, and it is better for them, as for all inferiors, that they should be under the rule of a master. Indeed, the use made of slaves and of tame animals is not very different. Unquote. There was a similar problem as regards interest in the absence of capital. People borrow money and pay interest for two reasons. They want to have capital goods or working capital with which to make income, to have machinery and equipment that will contribute to earnings, or to have goods in process of manufacture and sale from which income will be made. Or alternatively, interest is paid because someone with less money borrows it from someone with more to satisfy variously urgent personal needs, to permit present extravagance or to repair extravagance in the past. If capital goods and working capital are of little visible importance in the economy, as was true in the household economy of Aristotelian Greece, then the greatest part of the lending and borrowing is of the second sort, that is, for personal needs. In such circumstances, interest is not viewed as a production cost, but rather as something the more favored charge, the less fortunate or the less wise. So again, like slavery, it raises a problem in ethics. What is right, just, and decent in relations between those who are amply supplied with money and the feckless or needy. Not surprisingly, Aristotle strongly condemned the taking of interest. Quote, the most hated sort of money making, and with the greatest reason, is usury. For money was intended to be used in exchange, but not to increase at, at interest. Unquote. For the same reason that interest was an unworthy extraction from the less fortunate, arising from the possession of the money by the more fortunate, interest continued to be strongly condemned throughout the Middle Ages. And here there is a point for later emphasis. Only when interest was redefined as a payment for productive capital, when it became compellingly evident that the one who borrowed money made money out of doing so and should, in all justice, share some of the return with the original lender, did it become reputable. Religious precept and the accepted ethic were then not exceptionally adjusted to this circumstance. But the taking of interest on loans for personal need or use continued to have a slightly unwholesome, even suspect reputation. Here, the very distant past has echoes in the present. Interest for personal loans remains even today subjected to a certain measure of opprobrium and is thought to require regulation. The loan shark is excoriated and is widely assumed, not without reason, to be unduly prone to criminal association. Without wages and interest in the ancient world, there could not be a theory of prices in any modern sense. Prices derive in one way or another from production costs, and production costs were not a visible function in the slave owning household. So, it remained for Aristotle to ask only whether prices were just or fair, a concern that would be central to economic thought for most of the next 2000 years and the basis for the question posed to this day. Is that really a fair price? Nothing has so engaged economic attention over the centuries as the need to persuade people that the price given by the market has a justification superior to all ethical concern. To this also I will return. Aristotle gave attention to another problem with ethical overtones that was to be a continuing one for economists. Why are some of the most useful things the least valued in the market, while some of the least useful command the highest price? Well, into the 19th century, economic writers would still be struggling with the reason for the difference between value in use and value in exchange, with the fact that bread and clean drinking water are useful and relatively cheap, while silks and diamonds are much less useful and decidedly more expensive. Surely there is or was something ethically perverse here. It would be considered a major advance in economics when this problem was finally solved. On improvement in trade, the distant predecessor of the concern for economic growth, Aristotle, like the Romans who followed him, confined himself to suggestions for better agricultural organization and practice. And as did the Romans, he ascribed great moral superiority to farming, a view that would be echoed strongly by French economic writers in the 18th century and that has powerful resonance among farmers today. On money in its more elementary forms and uses, there cannot be a great deal said. It is merely a commodity that, because of its divisibility, durability, adequate but not unlimited availability, and consequent acceptability, occupies an intermediate role in exchange. Silver, gold, copper, iron, seashells, tobacco, cattle, and whiskey have have along with paper and bank deposits also served. It is only as its use as money gives a commodity a certain personality, mystique, and scarcity that its price, what one has to surrender in other commodities for its possession, becomes a special problem. And it is only as the commodity gives way to purely representational forms, paper or bank deposits, that any very grave mystery develops as to what determines the value of the money, or in common language, the general level of prices as established by the value of the money. By by Aristotle's time, in the 4th century BCE, coinage of metal in Greece had been long established. Already in the 5th century BCE, Herodotus had rendered his superb non sequitur on the subject. Quote unquote, the manners and customs of the Lydians do not essentially vary from those of Greece, except in the routine prostitution of the young women. They are the first people on record who coined gold and silver into money. Aristotle describes the origins of money with admirable clarity and succinctness, observing that the various necessaries of life are not easily carried about, and hence men agreed to employ in their dealings with each other something which was intrinsically useful and easily applicable to the purposes of life. For example, iron, silver, and the like. Of this, the value was at first measured by size and weight, but in process of time they put a stamp upon it to save the trouble of weighing and to mark the value. Having identified the nature of money and coinage, Aristotle goes on to a consideration of money making, which in its pure form he finds abhorrent. Quote, some men turn every quality or art into a means of making money. This they conceive to be the end, and to the promotion of the end, all things must contribute. Unquote. As with his position on usury, this observation of Aristotle's has remained accurate over the years, over the centuries. A superior modern example of his case is, no doubt, the young financial deal marker who surrenders all personal effort and conscience
That's
to
deal maker, sir.
okay, deal maker. Yeah, did I?
Yeah, you said deal marker. Go ahead. Anyway.
Oh, sorry. Okay. A superior modern example of his case is, no doubt, the young financial deal maker who surrenders all personal effort and conscience to pecuniary return and measures all personal achievement by its result. Perhaps Aristotle should still be read on Wall Street. However, when he goes on, one senses, not without effort, to distinguish between legitimate and illegitimate forms of money making. It need not detain us. One must here risk the unpardonable truth, which is that he does not make a great deal of sense. Scholars who have not found Aristotle wholly rewarding on the Athenian economy have turned to Xenophon, a student of Socrates and a man of practical turn of mind who, long after his campaign with the younger Cyrus and the writing of his immortal account of it in the Anabasis, concerned himself briefly with economics. In his Cyropedia and in anticipation of Adam Smith, he tells of the advantage accruing to a large as opposed to small city in the opportunity for specialization by trade for the division of labor, and in on the means of improving the revenues of the state of Athens. He considers the sources of the relative prosperity of the city and the means for enhancing it. The prosperity he attributes to the excellence of the surrounding agriculture, not something that is entirely obvious to the modern visitor, and he holds that it would be enhanced by extending hospitality and privileges to foreign merchants and seamen, not excluding the Spartans with whom he had notoriously consorted, by giving proper attention to public works, by sending all possible labor to mine silver, which he sees as a major component in the Athenian balance of payments, as it would now be called, and above all, by keeping the peace. The difference between prosperity and catastrophe Xenophon attributes in the flattest possible language to war, quote unquote, for those states assuredly are most prosperous which have remained at peace for the longest period, and of all states Athens is the best adapted by nature for flourishing during peace. Unquote. It is a seriously troubling matter that only rarely in the next 2400 years have economists addressed the economic costs of war and the economic rewards of peace and taken a strong professional stand on the choice. It is not too late. A final question raised by the Greeks that is of impressive modern relevance concerned the larger organizing and motivating force in the economy. Should it be, to put the matter rather too bluntly, self-interest or communism? This arose because of the presumed or suspected commitment to communism of Plato, a man not easily dismissed. His imagined state has its origin essentially as an economic entity, as an assemblage of the various occupations and professions necessary for civilized life, but residing over, guiding and protecting the state are the guardians who live a life of ascetic renunciation. They are denied property beyond the bare essentials. Their income is rigorously limited to need. What should they ever acquire homes or lands or monies of their own, they will become housekeepers and husbandmen instead of guardians, enemies and tyrants instead of allies of the other citizens. Unquote. There can be free enterprise at the bottom. Power must be with those at the top who avow a pure communist ethic. Plato's inclination to communism, however partial, has been a source of no slight concern for the more sensitive historians of the subject. Alas, that so universal a figure might have rendered him self-subject had he endured to surveillance by the Federal Bureau of Investigation and denunciation by the late Senator Joseph R. McCarthy. Professor Alexander Gray, a stalwart conservative, is at pains to point out that Plato's state is the communism of a limited group, the communism of the military encampment. It is not at all committed, like later manifestations, to revolt or to concepts of social, economic, and political equality. On the contrary, it divides firmly as between the rulers and the ruled, the beautiful and the damned. There is no true communist tendency here, but reassurance had come even earlier from the position taken by Plato's most renowned pupil, Aristotle, who is solidly on the side of property and self-interest. Quote, how immeasurably greater is the pleasure when a man feels a thing to be his own, for the love of self is a feeling implanted by nature and not given in vain. No one, when men have all things in common, will any longer set an example of liberality or do any liberal action. For liberality consists in the use which is made of property. Unquote. As sufficiently observed, it was ethical judgment, not the dry expository concerns of economics, that motivated Aristotle and the other great mentors of the Greeks. But already we see a tendency that recurs throughout the history of the subject and is central to its understanding on slavery, the position of women and public interest vis-a-vis self-interest. Ethical judgments Ethical judgments have a strong tendency to conform to what citizens of influence find it agreeable to believe. They reflect what I have elsewhere called the convenient social virtue. Over the intervening 2,500 years between Grecian times and our own, we shall find economists articulating the convenient social virtue to the consequent applause. But we will also find some who, out of the great dialectic of mind, voice, and adverse interest, challenged what the privileged, contented, and influential find it comfortable to believe. It is only thus that economic discussion is to be understood fully. Those who have written on the history of economic ideas are overwhelmingly in agreement on the small, even negligible, contribution of the Romans. They extended the praise of agriculture so that it became a paean. To this were added many suggestions on agricultural methods and management that of the self-sufficient estate, perhaps needless to say, not that of the commercial enterprise. There were doubts about the efficiency of slavery. Pliny observed that, quote, "It is the very worst plan of all to have land tilled by slaves let loose from the house of correction, as indeed is the case with all work entrusted to men who live without hope." Unquote. In the later empire, when the estates had grown very large, there was much regret over the passage of the smaller cultivator and much concern over the great scale of the latifundia. This also is a worry that had endured. Quote, "We must, whatever happens, safeguard the family farm." Unquote. There was, however, one major Roman contribution that, being outside the conventional boundaries of economics, has escaped the more conventional economic discussion. That was Roman law and the role therein of private property. The institution of private property far predates recorded history. In the most primitive of tribal communities, men laid claim to weapons, tools, and, alas, to women of their own. Personal property is accepted in all societies, including the socialist world. Possessions are everywhere an possessions are everywhere an aspect of personality itself. But it was Roman law that gave to property its formal identity and to its possessor the dominium, or rights, that are now assumed. These rights were comprehensive. They included the right not only of enjoyment and use, but also of misuse and abuse. Intrusion on them by others or the state would henceforth carry the burden of justification. No institution in the non-socialist world has rivaled in its importance private property and its use and pursuit. No institution has been so productive of social, economic, or political discord. The conservative in the non-socialist economy stands with unthinking eloquence for, quote unquote, the rights of private property, while those on the social left liberals in American parlance contentiously but cautiously assert the higher claims of the state or the public interest. And on the question of public or private ownership of, of productive property turns the great difference between the capitalist and socialist worlds. If Roman economic comment was slight, it was nonetheless the Roman genius to identify and give form to the institution that, more than any other, would be central to personal gratification, economic development, and political conflict in the centuries to come.
Wonderful, sir.
All right,
Wonderful.
sir. Yeah, there ends the chapter, chapter
There
number
ends the
two.
chapter. A lot of history, Roman and Greek mostly.
Yes,
It
sir.
has hooks into their culture as well as philosophical approach. So the one thing that I'd like to highlight here is how Plato described communism. It's not quite communism because there is a differentiation between the ruling elite and everybody else. But for the everybody else, and there was a distinction. So there's no concept of everybody is equal. At the same
Yes,
time,
yes,
the ruling elite were made to live on very meager, only based on needs, not based on anything else. So that was probably similar to communism, but the similarity ends there, right? And
yes,
the
yes,
emphasis on private property is also something that is a significant deviation from communism, basically, right? state is everything
Yeah,
kind of
yeah. Yes.
approach doesn't work. So
Yes, yes.
very early times and early ideas, basically, right? Nothing very deep.
Yes. Yeah,
So
yes, yes.
yeah, so more to come, basically, right? And
Yes,
the
yes.
next
But
chapter is yeah, go ahead, sir.
yes, sir, this chapter is also very interesting, sir. I enjoyed reading it actually.
Yeah,
Uh, Understanding the kind of uh, economy and the uh, part of culture that used to exist in ancient Greece, Athens, and Rome. Yeah, I've got quite a bit of knowledge over here as well, sir.
yeah, absolutely, absolutely. But then from a pure economic theory standpoint, you
Sir.
will see certain initial r- seeds of thought, basically, but nothing fully developed. Like for example, there is no statement of why food is less expensive, but diamonds are more expensive. Right?
Yeah, yeah. Yes,
You
sir.
get to the modern supply and demand theory or the theory of utility, for example, right?
Yes, yes,
The
yes.
relative value of items or commodities. Then you'll start
Yeah,
understanding it better. But in that day and age, the theory, the observation is there, but the theory is not
sir.
there to substantiate the observation. So again, early days,
Right,
right?
right, sir.
So there's
Yeah,
not much to really build upon yet. Basically, the early observations are
absolutely,
there.
sir.
That's all. Basically,
Yeah, yeah. Yes, sir. I can. Right. So there are, as you also said, uh, what the current historians could piece together is what had what is and what existed till now of the ancient times. So there is not much. I mean, to the point how they lived. I think it is also to be observed. Sir. Because so what I'm trying to say is the kind of economics that they were uh, the kind of economy that they were living in. I think that is not properly constructed because of the lack of maybe probably archaeological evidence uh, or scriptures that are available uh, uh, to this day. Uh, am I sounding
no, I mean,
correct, sir?
you have to go with what is available and what is
Yeah,
written. So
exactly,
there
sir.
is money, like currency used to be there, but
Yes,
not in a manner that we see it today. Right? It was still there as a
yes,
means to exchange value, so
yes,
to say.
yes.
Right? And then there's also
There
this
was
concept of
also
yeah. Go ahead.
the barter system in the very early days. Uh, like we have read in this chapter that even wine was used to trade with other commodities.
Yeah. So that the early sort of manifestation of currency was there. Then
Yeah,
there is the whole concept of interest being not very good, high interest rates being
yeah,
very
yes, yes,
oppressive. So that's also there. Ideas
yes,
that are more
yes,
established in this day and age, basically,
yes,
right?
yes, yes,
So given that, again, these are the early sort of you'll find the concepts that are very well developed in this day and age, or at least we think they are well developed. You'll
yes,
find the
yes,
early sort of signs of that coming in, basically, you know.
yes,
And
yes,
this whole ancient concept continued, right? Even today, like for example, in some of the Middle Eastern countries, the interest is seen not as a very good thing, you know.
ethically. Yeah,
Yeah, even that there's this whole halal economy or whatever it is, right? Where Banks don't pay you interest. You just use it as a holding and investing place, basically, right?
Absolutely.
Because
Yes.
yeah, so there's a belief that interest is whatever haram or whatever it is. So
Haram.
you'll find all those ideas sort of floating around, but obviously the
Mm,
author is moving across centuries because
mm,
obviously the author's interest is more in coming to the 19th century. Post-industrialized era is where all the action happens from an economic standpoint, right?
correct, sir.
So because now the masses are also getting organized into productive endeavors, instead of just providing
Yes.
their services, and that is when the
Yes.
real the wealth of nations starts coming into picture and things like that. So more interesting things to
Correct,
come.
sir.
Yeah.
Correct, sir. Correct.
Yeah. All right, sir. So with this, we'll bring
Wonderful.
this session to a close. Next chapter is
Sure, sir.
called. Hang on 1 second. Let me pull up the name of the next
The
chapter. It's called the
enduring
enduring
interim.
interim. Yeah, the enduring interim. So with that
Okay.
chapter, we'll come back with the reading of that in the next session. Whoever is watching the video, please like and subscribe if you have not already done so. If you have any questions or comments, please put them in the comments under the video, and we'll make sure that we'll address them. All right.
Thank you very much, sir.
Yeah.
Thank you,
Thank you.
all the audience, and also about to watch. Thank you.